The people of Florida will remember this day forever. A lion killed 24 students during a field trip. But what led to this traffic accident? Keep watching as we dive deeper into this shocking case. The sun rose early that morning, casting a golden glow over the lush Florida landscape, painting everything in hues of amber and soft orange. The air was warm and thick with humidity, as it often was in the state during the late spring. A light breeze fluttered through the trees, the leaves rustling gently, as if nature itself was preparing for the events that would soon unfold. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that seemed to promise nothing but tranquility. For 24 college students, it was a day of adventure, excitement, and curiosity, a day that would mark a new chapter in their academic lives. The students, all from a university in Miami, had gathered early outside the gates of the Lions Gate Reserve, a private wildlife safari park located just outside of Orlando. The park, known for its exotic wildlife and vast safari grounds, had been the perfect place for a field trip for students studying biology, ecology, and animal behavior. The day's itinerary was simple: a guided tour of the reserve to observe the park's various animals in their natural habitats. It was supposed to be a day of learning, a day to deepen their understanding of the natural world. They had been looking forward to it for weeks. Laughter echoed through the small crowd as they gathered near the entrance, some students talking excitedly about the animals they were most eager to see, others snapping selfies in front of the massive reserve gates. The tour guide, a young woman in her early 30s, smiled as she greeted the students and led them toward the waiting safari buses. Her name was Emma, and she was the designated guide for the day. With her bright eyes and warm smile, she seemed the perfect guide for this group of eager, young students. She had worked at the park for 3 years and had seen plenty of visitors, but today something felt different. There was an unspoken energy in the air, as though the atmosphere itself was bracing for something more. Still, Emma pushed those thoughts aside, telling herself it was simply the anticipation of the day. But there was something lurking behind the calm exterior of this perfect day. The park itself had been experiencing tensions of its own in the weeks leading up to the trip. Behind the scenes, the staff had been dealing with a series of problems that had slowly escalated. One of the most concerning issues was with the lion enclosure, a massive area designed to house the park's prize lions. For months, there had been reports of cracks in the fencing, loose sections of wire, and malfunctioning security systems. Some of the lions, particularly the older males, had become more agitated than usual, pacing restlessly and displaying behavior that was uncharacteristic for the species. The staff had noticed these signs, but the repairs were costly, and the park was already struggling financially. As a result, many of the issues were either overlooked or dismissed as being insignificant. It wasn't until the day of the tour that the full scope of these problems would come to light. Despite these looming issues, the students were blissfully unaware of the underlying tension. The trip proceeded as planned, with the students unaware of the dangers that lurked just beyond their view. The bus took them deeper into the reserve, and they continued to marvel at the sight of wild animals roaming freely in their habitats. It was as if the world had slowed down around them, and for a moment, nothing seemed to matter except the beauty of nature and the thrill of the safari. The lions, those majestic and powerful creatures, were still a distance away, behind sturdy fences and thick glass viewing walls, but even from afar, their presence was undeniable. Some students pressed their faces to the bars of the bus, hoping to get a better look at them. Emma spoke briefly about the lions as the bus neared the enclosure, recounting their history and significance to the reserve. She told the students how the lions were one of the park's most famous attractions, how they had been raised in the reserve from birth and had never known the wild. They were considered safe, protected from the dangers of the outside world. As Emma spoke, she didn't notice the way the students' attention was shifting from the animals outside the window to the collective nervous energy that seemed to be building among them. The group was still excited, but a subtle undercurrent of unease had begun to settle in the air. It wasn't overt, it was just a faint, almost imperceptible feeling, but it was there, threading its way through the group like a thin, delicate strand. The bus slowed as it approached the lion exhibit, the giant enclosure coming into view. The students leaned forward in their seats, eager to catch their first close-up glimpse of the lions. The sight was breathtaking. The lions, with their golden manes and fierce eyes, were magnificent creatures. Some lay lounging in the shade, while others paced restlessly along the perimeter of the enclosure, their powerful muscles rippling with each movement. A few of the lions turned their gaze toward the bus, their eyes locking with those of the students. It was a look of primal power, and in that moment, there was an unsettling sense of something more. Emma's voice echoed in the quiet air, urging the students to move toward the elevated viewing platform for a closer look. They followed her instructions eagerly, climbing the stairs and gathering at the railings to get a better view. The platform gave them an unobstructed view of the lions, and the students marveled at the beauty of these dangerous creatures. It was the perfect moment. They were safe, enclosed within a secure structure, and the lions were a beautiful and distant spectacle. But there, in the midst of their awe, a change began to occur. Unnoticed by the students, a low growl reverberated from deep within the lion enclosure. The sound was barely audible over the excited chatter of the students, but it was enough to make one or two of the lions look up sharply. A shift in the air, a ripple of tension, was passing through the enclosure. The lions were on edge. No one could know then that this would be the last peaceful moment for the students of that safari. The calm, beautiful morning was about to shatter, and what began as a peaceful excursion into nature would soon descend into chaos and horror. The sun continued to shine, unaware of the impending storm. The lion enclosure was a massive and imposing structure, a testament to the park's efforts to replicate the animal's natural habitat as closely as possible. The walls were made of reinforced steel and strong, tall mesh fencing that rose up like an imposing barrier. It was designed to be secure, allowing visitors to observe the lions without ever coming into direct contact with them. But as the students gathered around the elevated viewing platform, watching the magnificent creatures from a safe distance, there was something about the enclosure that felt off. The ground within the enclosure was a mix of dry, cracked earth and patches of sparse, yellowing grass that had seen better days. Trees and shrubs dotted the perimeter, providing some semblance of shelter for the lions. But it was clear that the enclosure, though large, was not truly wilderness. It was a controlled environment, built by humans to keep the lions in check, to prevent them from roaming freely, from being what they were meant to be. The air inside the enclosure had a staleness to it, a feeling of being confined, as if the lions, no matter how majestic, could never truly be free. And yet, they made the most of it. The male lions, their golden manes, thick and wild, seemed to be the undisputed kings of the space. They moved with a regal authority, pacing along the perimeter, their massive paws silently gliding across the earth. Every step they took exuded power and dominance. Their eyes, dark and penetrating, scanned the space with an unsettling intensity. They were aware of every movement, every sound, and most importantly, they were aware of the presence of the visitors on the platform. Their heads turned in the direction of the students, the muscles in their necks flexing as they locked their gaze with the humans. It was as though they were measuring the distance between themselves and the strange creatures peering at them from behind the fence. The female lions were more subtle, less imposing in their physicality, but they were no less dangerous. They moved more fluidly, their movements quick and precise, like a predator on the hunt. Some lay lounging in the shaded areas, their amber eyes partially closed, but every so often, one of them would stand and stalk the perimeter, sniffing the air. They seemed to be watching, calculating, like sentinels on the lookout for any potential threat. Despite their more laid-back demeanor, the female lions were just as capable of sudden violent action as the males. The children, still pressing their faces against the railing of the viewing platform, were unaware of how dangerous the lions were in that moment. They saw them as symbols of wild beauty, of freedom. They didn't see the way the animals' muscles rippled beneath their coats, or the way their sharp claws clicked against the metal fence as they paced. The students were enchanted by their beauty, not realizing that the lions, though confined, were still predators. They had only the thinnest of barriers separating them from their human audience. Emma, the tour guide, had been telling the students about the lion's behavior patterns when she noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The lions, who had been lazily observing the humans, suddenly grew more alert. The pacing became quicker, more erratic. The growls that had been low and occasional before became louder, more frequent, reverberating through the air. The students, caught up in the excitement of seeing the lions up close, didn't immediately notice the shift. They continued to take pictures, pointing and laughing, lost in the excitement of their surroundings. The staff, who had been monitoring the lions from a separate observation post, began to grow concerned. They had been aware of the animals' recent unease, but they had chalked it up to the changing weather patterns, the rising temperatures, or perhaps the increase in the number of tourists. They had no reason to believe that the lions would do anything other than behave as they always had. The fences were strong, the safety measures in place, and the park had never had an incident before. But as the tension in the enclosure rose, so too did the unease of the animals. The sound of low, rumbling growls became more frequent. One of the lions, a large male with a dark mane, paced in a tight circle, its tail flicking back and forth in agitation. The others followed suit, their movements more agitated, their eyes darting nervously toward the students on the platform. Emma, who had been explaining the lion's feeding habits, caught the shift in the atmosphere and fell silent. She noticed the way the lions were looking at the students. They were no longer passive, no longer indifferent. There was something more in their gaze now. They were no longer just creatures in captivity. They were predators, sizing up their prey. At first, it was subtle. The lions were simply on edge, their body language tense, their eyes fixated on the humans. But Emma knew that even the slightest change in their behavior could signal something more dangerous. She had been trained to recognize these signs. In all her years working at the park, she had never seen the lions act like this before. She hesitated for a moment, trying to gauge whether it was a typical territorial display or something more ominous. But deep down, she felt that there was a nervous energy in the air that she couldn't shake. The enclosure, once a symbol of control and safety, began to feel like a trap. The students, oblivious to the rising tension, continued to snap pictures and comment on how beautiful the lions were. But Emma, the only one who could see the change, knew something had shifted. She took a step back from the platform, trying to subtly signal to the staff to be prepared, to watch the lions closely. But the staff, too, had grown complacent over the years, trusting in the safety measures that had always been in place. They didn't yet understand the severity of the situation. The lions, who had been content to rest and wander, began to approach the edge of the enclosure. Their massive bodies moved with a quiet intensity. Their eyes remained fixed on the group, unblinking. It was as if they had decided, in that moment, that something was off. Something in the air had changed, and they were ready to act on it. Inside the enclosure, the lions were no longer passive zoo animals. They were predators, hungry and alert, sensing that something had disturbed their domain. And the students, oblivious to the growing danger, were simply too close to the wildness they had come to witness. The tension in the air had been building for what seemed like an eternity, an invisible pressure pressing down on the students and the staff alike. No one could pinpoint the exact moment it started to shift, but it was undeniable now. The lions had crossed an invisible line. The once docile creatures, content to sit in the shade or pace idly within their enclosure, had suddenly become erratic. Their movements, once graceful and measured, now carried a weight of aggression, as though something had snapped within them, something primal, untamable. At first, it wasn't much, just a few moments of heightened activity. The male lion, whose mane had always looked like it belonged to royalty, started pacing the length of the fence, his movements sharp and stiff, his tail flicking in agitation. The others followed suit, their sleek bodies shifting restlessly as they circled the enclosure, eyes now narrowed and watchful. The staff, still observing from a distance, noticed the change but thought little of it. Animals, after all, could have off days, just like people. Then, without warning, the first attack happened. It was a young lioness, smaller than the males but quick as lightning, who made the first move. The students, many of them still oblivious to the growing danger, continued to joke and laugh, taking pictures and leaning over the railing of the viewing platform. It was supposed to be another normal day at the zoo, but it quickly became a nightmare. Without any discernible warning, the lioness charged, her body flowing with the precision of a predator. She was fast, too fast for the human eye to follow as she leapt at the edge of the enclosure. Her powerful paws hit the ground with a thud that sent a ripple through the crowd. The sound of her claws scraping the metal floor, sending chills through everyone present. One of the students, standing closest to the edge of the platform, turned at the last second, just in time to see the lioness's eyes wide, intent, and filled with something that could only be described as hunger. The student didn't have time to scream, to move. The lioness leaped against the steel barrier, her teeth bared in an instant as she swiped a paw with terrifying speed. The force of the attack reverberated through the viewing platform. The students who had been standing on the other side of the fence stumbled backward in shock, their mouths agape. The first victim, a girl in the front row, had been too close to the edge. In a swift, brutal motion, the lioness's claws scraped across the metal, sending a jagged shard of the barrier flying. The young girl, caught off guard, recoiled and stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet. It happened so quickly that no one had a chance to react least of all the victim. The girl screamed, the sound echoing through the enclosure as the lioness twisted back to survey the crowd once again. Panic spread like wildfire. The laughter and chatter that had once filled the air were replaced by shrieks of terror, the sound of frantic footsteps as students rushed toward the exit. But the gates of the viewing platform were locked, and the staff, already caught off guard, were rushing to figure out what had happened. In that instant, chaos erupted. The lions, sensing the sudden shift, became even more aggressive. The male lion, who had been content to pace, suddenly roared a deep, guttural sound that reverberated throughout the entire zoo. It was a sound that carried the weight of authority, a warning that sent waves of fear coursing through the crowd. The other lions, now energized by their pack mentality, began to move toward the visitors, their once distant gaze now focused with laser-like precision on their targets. Their movements were a blur of muscle and fur, a terrifying dance that played out in real time, and the crowd was trapped, caught in the crossfire of a beastly terror they couldn't escape. In the confusion, a second attack happened almost immediately. A large, male lion, whose mane had looked so majestic moments ago, lunged at the base of the viewing platform. His massive paws slammed against the steel, shaking the structure. It was a warning, though no one could fully comprehend it until it was too late. A student, terrified, and caught in the sudden surge of people rushing for the exit, tripped and fell, her body sliding down the steep incline of the platform. Her fall brought her directly into the lion's path. For a second, time seemed to slow. The lion's golden eyes locked onto the falling student, his pupils narrowing as his massive body coiled with lethal intent. The students, in their panic, watched as the lion leaped, his claws outstretched, the predator moving with terrifying grace. There was no way to warn her in time. The lion's claws connected with the student's leg, sending her tumbling backward, her screams cut short by the roar that followed. Blood mixed with dirt as she was dragged back into the lion's enclosure with frightening speed. The sight was too much. The entire platform had devolved into a full-fledged panic. People were screaming, shoving one another in their desperate attempt to flee, but the exits were not as close as they had thought. A sense of helplessness gripped the crowd as the lions, emboldened by the chaos, attacked with more ferocity. The staff, trying to contain the situation, could do little to stop the attacks. The emergency protocols were in place for a reason, but the lions had already broken through the psychological barrier that had separated them from the humans. They were no longer zoo animals, they were predators on the hunt. In the melee, there were more screams, more attacks. The male lion with the dark mane was now at the base of the viewing platform, his enormous jaws snapping at the students who had fallen, the heat of his breath rising with every motion. His roar echoed in the confined space as his massive form lunged toward another group of students, their collective fear driving them into each other as they scrambled to find safety. The cries of the students, mixed with the horrific sounds of claws against flesh and bone, filled the air, drowning out everything else. Panic overtook reason, and the crowd was no longer a group of people. Each student became an individual, scrambling for survival. The lions, now acting on instinct, were a blur of terror. One by one, they took their prey, relentless in their pursuit. It was no longer just an attack, it was a slaughter. The lions, whose wild instincts had been triggered by a mix of aggression, fear, and hunger, tore through the crowd with methodical, deadly precision. Every student in their path was an opportunity to assert dominance, to remind the humans of the power they held. And for the victims, there was no escape. The roar of the lions echoed through the chaos, a terrifying reminder of the primal power that had been unleashed. Panic had taken over every corner of the enclosure. The students who were lucky enough to avoid the first few attacks were now trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The once peaceful zoo grounds had transformed into a battlefield, and survival was no longer a given, it was a frantic, desperate fight. In the early moments of the attack, the crowd had been caught completely off guard. They had been there to learn, to observe nature, to marvel at the strength and grace of the lions from behind the safety of barriers. But that safety had been shattered in an instant. The platform, once a solid, sturdy structure, was now a maze of people running in every direction, pushing and shoving as they tried to escape the growing threat. The sounds of screaming and the pounding of feet reverberated through the air, mixing with the terrifying roars of the lions that had now surrounded the area. Some students had fallen, their bodies trapped beneath others in the frenzy to flee. The young man closest to the entrance had managed to scramble toward the gates, but the panic and the stampede were too much. His path was blocked by the crushing mass of people, their terror so absolute that they were willing to sacrifice anything, including one another, to escape. He turned back, desperately trying to find another route, but the lions had already begun to spread out. Their movements were swift, calculating. Their eyes, narrowed and predatory, scanned the crowd with a cold, savage intelligence. One of the lions, a massive male with dark golden fur, had found a target. A girl, barely 14, had tripped and fallen as she tried to run, her hands skimming the concrete as she tried to push herself back up. In that fleeting moment of vulnerability, the lion pounced. Its claws sank deep into the ground as its powerful body propelled it toward its prey. The girl didn't have time to scream. She could only feel the weight of the beast's enormous paws crashing down on her chest, knocking the wind out of her, her body too weak to fight back. The lion's jaws snapped shut just inches from her face, its hot breath like a furnace. Behind the chaos, another lioness, smaller but equally dangerous, began to move toward a group of students huddled near a tree. The lioness darted through the crowd with lightning speed, her movements a blur of fur and muscle. The students, in their panic, tried to run, but the lioness was faster. She leaped at the closest figure, a young man, and took him down in a single swipe of her paw. Blood sprayed in a wide arc as the students screamed, their limbs tangled together as they stumbled backward. They had no clear path to safety. There was nowhere to go. The ground beneath them seemed to have turned to quicksand, each step they took only sinking them deeper into the nightmare. On the far side of the enclosure, another male lion had singled out a group of girls who had clustered together by a small kiosk. They had been trying to call for help on their phones, but the signal had been jammed by the zoo's emergency systems. The phone lines were down, and all they could do now was try to escape. But it was too late. The lion, eyes wide with hunger, padded silently toward them. Its movements were eerily calm, as though it was savoring the moment. The girls, their faces pale with fear, turned to flee, but the lion was upon them before they could even take a single step. The sound of their screams was drowned out by the roar of the beast, its powerful jaws clamping down on one of the girls with a sickening crack. She was gone in an instant. The zoo, once a place of curiosity and wonder, had turned into an unrecognizable hell. People were fighting for survival, shoving and scrambling, trampling over one another, in their attempts to escape the lions' relentless assault. The emergency exits had been locked down in an attempt to contain the situation, but they only added to the panic. The students, most of them in a state of pure terror, realized too late that there was no safe escape. The lions had them cornered. Some tried to climb the nearby trees, but the branches weren't sturdy enough to support their weight. Others attempted to barricade themselves in the nearest buildings, but the doors were already too far gone, blocked by the sheer number of people running toward them. The ground had become a war zone, littered with the bodies of the fallen, their cries lost in the chaos. Blood stained the concrete, marking the path of destruction the lions had left in their wake. The staff, too, were scrambling to regain control of the situation, but it was clear they were overwhelmed. Their weapons, designed to subdue animals and not to fight against something as powerful and determined as a lion, were useless. They fired tranquilizer darts, but they missed, or the lions shrugged them off, too wild, too far gone in their frenzy. Every dart that was shot was a wasted effort, and the lions were growing more aggressive with each passing moment. The zoo was no longer a place of captivity, for Themet was their domain now, and they ruled with an iron paw. As the minutes stretched on, the situation became more hopeless. The once structured group of students had scattered, their unity shattered by the chaos that had unfolded so quickly. Some were still running, their faces streaked with tears and sweat, their breaths coming in desperate gasps as they tried to find any means of escape. Others were huddling together in corners, too terrified to move, too shocked to think. The only thing that mattered now was survival, and there were fewer and fewer people left who could hold on to that hope. The attacks had become more frequent, more brutal, and the fear that had been so palpable at the beginning was now a suffocating fog that hung over the zoo like a blanket. And through it all, the lions continued their hunt, their roars punctuating the cries of the students, their movements seamless and swift. There was no escape, no sanctuary, just the terrifying realization that, in that moment, survival was a distant dream of fleeting hope that had already been torn apart by the savagery of nature's finest predators. The aftermath of the attack left the zoo grounds eerily silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just hours before. The once bustling area was now a wasteland of blood, broken bodies, and the lingering scent of fear that seemed to cling to the air like a heavy fog. The lions, their hunger sated and their territorial instincts calmed, had retreated into the shadows of their enclosure, as though nothing had ever happened. Their golden eyes, now dulled with the fading rush of adrenaline, watched from a distance, unaware of the devastation they had caused. But the world beyond their domain would never be the same. The scene at the zoo was a nightmare in real time, a vision of destruction that defied belief. The bodies of the students lay scattered across the grounds, some crushed underfoot in the stampede, others torn apart by the brutal power of the lions. Their faces, frozen in expressions of horror, seemed to tell a story that no one would ever fully comprehend. The ones who had managed to run, who had tried to flee to safety, were now reduced to lifeless forms, their once promising futures extinguished in the blink of an eye. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, a sharp reminder of the violence that had unfolded in such a short span of time. Every corner of the zoo bore witness to the horror. The viewing platforms, now abandoned, were stained with the remnants of those who had once marveled at the lions from a safe distance. The pathways, once clean and neatly paved, were now marred by tracks of blood, footprints that led nowhere. Shattered glass from the broken viewing windows glistened in the sun, reflecting a light that was somehow wrong, too bright for the tragedy that had unfolded. In the aftermath, there was no sense of order, no sense of anything but the raw, unrelenting reality of the loss. The staff, who had survived the attack, were in a dazed stupor, some still standing in shock, unable to move, others stumbling through the wreckage, trying in vain to offer help where there was none. The sounds of distant sirens could be heard faintly in the background, a signal that the outside world had begun to respond, but it was clear they were too late. For those who had been caught in the lion's wrath, nothing would bring them back. As the first responders arrived, Police, paramedics, and animal control officers, they were met with a scene that could only be described as a war zone. The bodies of the students, some torn beyond recognition, were carefully extracted from the wreckage, their identities being pieced together in a grim process of elimination. The officers moved swiftly, securing the area and preventing anyone from entering the site of the attack, but it was impossible to ignore the scope of the disaster that lay before them. What had once been a place of education and wonder had become a mausoleum, its gates forever closed to those who might have walked through them in search of knowledge and curiosity. The media arrived soon after, their cameras capturing the devastation, the faces of the survivors, and the faces of the grieving families who had lost children in the attack. The story spread like wildfire, a horrific headline that dominated news outlets across the country. The images of the bloodied zoo grounds, the lifeless bodies of the students, and the empty eyes of the lions would be etched in the memories of millions for years to come. For the families of the victims, the grief was indescribable. The students who had been killed were children, their lives barely begun, their futures filled with potential. Their parents, now standing in front of the shattered remains of their children's lives, were left to pick up the pieces of a puzzle that could never be completed. The questions began to flood in how had this happened? Why hadn't the zoo been better prepared? How had the lions breached the barriers? And what had triggered such a violent response from the animals? But answers were in short supply. The attack had been so sudden, so brutal, that no one could explain why it had happened, or why it had happened to so many innocent people. For the survivors, the trauma was just beginning. The few students who had managed to escape were left to carry the weight of the horrors they had witnessed. They would never forget the sounds of the lions' roars, the sight of their classmates being torn apart in front of their eyes. Many would struggle to make sense of what had occurred, replaying every moment in their minds, searching for something, anything, that could explain why the lions had acted with such ferocity. But there would be no answers, only the scars that would never heal. The zoo, once a popular tourist destination, was now closed indefinitely. The staff, some of whom had been involved in the attacks, were sent for psychological evaluations, while the lions, the source of so much pain, were taken into custody by animal control. Their fates remained uncertain whether they would be euthanized, relocated to a different sanctuary, or simply left to live out their lives in captivity. The debate over the ethical treatment of animals, of the zoo's responsibility in maintaining safety, would become a national conversation. But for the families who had lost loved ones, no policy changes or public outcry would ever bring their children back. As the days passed and the investigation into the attack began, the town, the state, and even the nation tried to come to terms with what had happened. Memorial services were held, and tributes poured in for the young lives that had been lost. But the horror of that day would never be erased. The images, the stories, the memories each would haunt those who had been touched by the tragedy, forever ingrained in their minds as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the unpredictability of nature, and the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of safety. For the lions, nothing would change. They had returned to their cages, their behaviors studied, analyzed, and scrutinized by experts who could only offer hypotheses. But in the end, the lions had only acted on instinct, the instinct to hunt, to kill, to survive. It was the human world that had failed to protect its own. And that, perhaps, was the most devastating realization of all. The investigation into the deadly lion attack began with a sense of disbelief, but quickly shifted into a harrowing search for answers. The park, once a popular attraction in the area, was now under intense scrutiny. The authorities, including animal control experts, law enforcement, and wildlife specialists, were called in to determine how such a tragedy had unfolded, and whether the zoo's safety protocols had been violated. At first, it seemed straightforward. The lions were supposed to be contained within their enclosure, and the zoo had claimed they followed the highest standards for animal safety and visitor protection. However, as the investigation deepened, a dark web of neglect, poor oversight, and possible cover-ups began to unravel. Forensics teams combed through the scene, gathering evidence from the bodies of the victims, the zoo staff, and the lion's enclosure. They analyzed blood samples, claw marks, and even the movements of the animals themselves. The forensic specialists noted the size and depth of the claw marks found on the ground near the viewing area. It was clear the lions had breached the perimeter before the chaos erupted, but the how and why were unclear. The zoo's maintenance records were subpoenaed, revealing troubling lapses in regular upkeep. Some of the enclosures had not been inspected as frequently as required by law, and crucial structural repairs were delayed, despite reports of wear and tear. The gate that was supposed to secure the lion's den had been malfunctioning for weeks before the attack, yet no immediate action had been taken to resolve the issue. The zoo had allowed these problems to persist, driven by a need to cut costs and avoid downtime. That negligence, it seemed, had led to a catastrophic failure. It became evident that the zoo's management had been hiding the extent of these issues from the public and local authorities. The safety of the visitors, it seemed, had been secondary to the financial pressures of running the park. Investigators unearthed a series of internal emails and memos that discussed cutting costs, reducing staff, and increasing visitor capacity decisions that may have put lives at risk. Yet these were decisions made not out of malice, but out of an overwhelming desire to maintain profit margins and continue attracting large crowds. The staff members who survived the attack were interviewed, but their stories were inconsistent, clouded by the trauma of what they had witnessed. Some described hearing warning calls from other workers about the lions becoming agitated, but it was clear they had not responded quickly enough to prevent the tragedy. Others spoke of a sense of complacency that had overtaken them in recent months. They were so used to the routine of feeding and tending to the animals, they had grown numb to the inherent dangers of their jobs. The park had become a place where the thrill of seeing exotic animals had outweighed the importance of keeping a watchful eye. In the aftermath of the attack, the community began to ask uncomfortable questions. How could something so violent, so preventable, have happened in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for both humans and animals? Local residents who had once taken their children to the zoo for weekend trips now found themselves horrified by the thought of it. The lion's enclosure, once seen as a symbol of awe and admiration, was now a symbol of failure and danger. As the investigation progressed, the zoo's owners, who had been relatively quiet in the immediate aftermath, were called to answer for their role in the tragedy. Their reluctance to speak and their failure to address the issues openly only fueled suspicions that they had known about the problems, but had done little to fix them. With the public outcry mounting and news stories spreading across national media, the pressure on the zoo's leadership intensified. They were forced into a corner, with many questioning whether they should face criminal charges for their negligence, or whether the blame lay solely with the animals themselves. Public opinion shifted dramatically in the days that followed. What had initially been seen as a freak accident, a tragic event that could not have been anticipated, soon became a dark reflection of corporate greed and systemic failures. The truth about the zoo's negligence was starting to spread, and the people of Florida, particularly those who had lost loved ones, were demanding justice. The investigation was no longer just about the attack itself, but about holding the zoo accountable for the years of disregard for safety that had led to it. In the midst of all the turmoil, the lions were placed under quarantine, their fate hanging in the balance. Experts debated whether they should be put down or transferred to another sanctuary, but the ultimate decision would come down to the findings of the investigation. The question that remained was not just whether the lions had acted in self-defense or out of provocation, but whether they had been given the chance to behave as they naturally would in an environment that treated them with the care and respect they deserved. The investigation continued for weeks, peeling back layers of the park's operations, and in the end, it left the community with more questions than answers. While the immediate cause of the attack was understood, the broader issues of negligence and the exploitation of animals in captivity were thrown into stark relief. In the end, the park's dark secret was out, and its reputation was irreparably tarnished. What had once been a beloved community attraction was now an example of what can happen when profit is placed above safety, and when the animals in our care are seen not as creatures to be protected, but as commodities to be used for entertainment,